Call the meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. Pursuant to the order of reference of Monday, January 29th, in Section 72 of the Proceeds of Crime and Terrorism Financing Act, statutory review of the Act. We have with us this morning actually the first witnesses on what is going to be a fairly major undertaking on the 5-year review. We have from the Department of Finance Annette Ryan, who's Associate Assistant Deputy Minister, Financial Sector, Policy Branch. Ian Wright, Director, Financial Crimes Governances and Operations. And Maxime Beaupre, Director, Financial Crimes Policy. So the floor is yours, I guess, Annette. I believe you have an opening statement, and then we'll go from there. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is a sincere pleasure to appear before this committee as you begin your review of the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act. I'll also refer to it by its better-known acronym of PCML-TFA, or more simply, the Act. My intention today is to give you a brief overview of the importance of combating money laundering and terrorist financing and explain the goals and structure of Canada's anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing regime. I'll also review Canada's recent international peer review evaluation and then describe the efforts we've taken with federal and private sector partners to assess and expand this international peer input. With federal partners, we have summarized all of this advice in a policy discussion paper, which we released yesterday. The paper is intended to support your committee's current review, and we hope that the paper will serve as a helpful baseline in your deliberations. Le blanchiment d'argent.
Money laundering and terrorist financing are crimes that facilitate and reward the committing of other crimes, such as those perpetrated by organized crime, by terrorists or terrorist groups, as well as the actions of those who practice tax avoidance or tax evasion. These financial crimes can take place in Canada or abroad, but they affect all Canadians. Canada's anti-money laundering system was established in 2000 in order to combat these threats, with the addition of the mandate relating to anti-terrorist financing in 2001.
Deter criminals and terrorist financiers from using Canadian financial institutions and other entities for their criminal purposes, and to provide appropriate tools to law enforcement to combat money laundering and terrorist financing, while also respecting the privacy rights of Canadians and minimizing the compliance burden on private sector reporting entities. Canada has a stable and open economy, an accessible and advanced financial system, and strong democratic institutions. Those seeking to launder proceeds of crime or raise, transfer, and use funds for terrorism purposes try to exploit these strengths.
Because of their deterrent effect, it is important to have efficient regimes in place in order to combat these financial crimes and to protect Canadians, as well as the integrity of the markets and the world financial system.
Legislative and regulatory framework is required to effectively detect and deter criminal activity. This framework has evolved and matured in recent decades by adopting and adapting international best practices, as informed by domestic threat risk assessments and close collaboration among partners. Doing so allows Canada to meet our international commitments in the fight against transnational crime and terrorism, and to bring new intelligence and tools to domestic security efforts. Canada takes a comprehensive and coordinated approach to combating money laundering and terrorist financing. This regime involves coordinated action by 13 federal departments and agencies, in addition to law enforcement entities across the country. The overarching objective of the regime and the Act, as I said, is to detect and deter money laundering and terrorist financing, while facilitating the investigation and prosecution of these crimes. The objectives thus place equal emphasis on preventing illicit funds from entering or moving through Canada's financial system and creating a paper trail to assist law enforcement in detecting and prosecuting these crimes. Les entités déclarant, reporting agencies.
The reporting agencies also play a very important role in achieving these objectives. They are financial institutions, as well as designated non-financial businesses and professions that are the guardians of the financial system. Under the legislation, they are required to identify their clients appropriately and to keep records of this documentation, to exercise their duty of care or due diligence with respect to their clients, and to continually monitor their operations, as well as submit compulsory reports.
Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre, FINTRAC, ou CANAF, Canada's Financial Intelligence Unit, receives those reports and analyzes the financial information they contain. In addition, FINTRAC, as a regulator, ensures the compliance of reporting entities with their obligations under the Act. The framework also contains measures that are critical to support law enforcement in pursuing money laundering and terrorist financing. This includes requirements to keep proper documentation, which law enforcement can access through court-mandated orders. It includes reports that are provided to FINTRAC when thresholds of suspicion are met. Once reports are analyzed by FINTRAC, the resulting actionable financial intelligence is disclosed to law enforcement when it meets the threshold of reasonable grounds to suspect that this information would be relevant to the investigation of a money laundering or terrorist financing offense. In turn, law enforcement, national security, and other investigative bodies, supported by FINTRAC's disclosures of financial intelligence, undertake investigations in relation to money laundering, terrorist financing, other profit-oriented crimes, and threats to the security of Canada in accordance with their individual mandates in order to disrupt, prosecute, and sanction these criminal activities.
In its efforts to protect Canadians through measures to combat money laundering and the funding of terrorist activities, the Government of Canada is committed to respecting the sharing of constitutional jurisdiction, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the rights of Canadians to the protection of their personal information. Although the Act requires that private financial information be provided to FINTRAC, the law also contains very strict provisions to ensure that charter rights and personal information are respected.
The information that FINTRAC can receive and disclose. It sets out the specific law enforcement and intelligence agencies to which FINTRAC may disclose the financial intelligence. The Act also limits the circumstances in which FINTRAC must disclose information to these agencies. FINTRAC must have reasonable grounds to suspect that the information would be relevant to the investigation or prosecution of a money laundering or terrorist financing offense, or relevant to the investigation of threats to the security of Canada. Unlike other intelligence agencies, FINTRAC does not conduct investigations. This set of safeguards supports FINTRAC's independence from law enforcement agencies.
Since the promulgation of the Act in the year 2000, the regime has undergone 2 parliamentary reviews, 3 reviews on the part of the Privacy Commission, as well as a number of external evaluations. These exercises contributed to developing certain changes to the legislative framework in order to respond to evolving threats and provide better support to law enforcement. Over time, This framework has evolved in order to add new reporting entities as well as new recipients that are able to receive information from FINTRAC, as well as to add to existing obligations or adding new ones.
Framework is critical to combating money laundering and terrorist financing in Canada and globally. These transactions do not stop at national borders, and strong national anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing regimes enhance the integrity and stability of the global financial system. Given the interconnectedness of the financial system, the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing can be undermined if there are weak links in the chain of efforts by national authorities. Le Groupe d'Action Financière, FATF,
The Financial Action Task Force, FATF, is an intergovernmental organization establishing world standards with respect to anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist funding activities. FATF monitors the implementation of these standards by states through mutual examinations and the publication of reports so that all countries in the world are judged on the same footing. Canada is a founding member of FATF and takes an active part in its proceedings.
Mutual Evaluation Report of Canada in 2016. Overall, the evaluation found that Canada has strong anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing legislation and regulations, and that the regime is effective. They did, however, note a number of areas where technical action could be taken to ensure the framework meets international standards to be even more effective. The report found that Canada has a good understanding of its money laundering and terrorist financing risks, and that anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing cooperation and coordination are generally good at the policy and operational levels. In addition, Canada was assessed as having financial institutions that have a good understanding of their risks and obligations and generally apply adequate mitigating measures. Reporting entities that are generally subject to an appropriate risk-sensitive supervision framework, financial intelligence that is used by law enforcement agencies to aid investigations, prioritized pursuit of terrorist financing activities, provision of useful mutual legal assistance and extradition, and a comprehensive sanction regime against Iran and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That said, the mutual evaluation process identified areas for improvement in Canada's regime. Notably, these include a limited availability of accurate beneficial ownership information to be used by competent authorities, the fact that the legal profession in Canada is not covered by the PCML-TFA, the fact that other vulnerable sectors are also not covered. This includes finance and leasing companies, as well as unregulated mortgage lenders. They found a gap in the application of the Act requirements related to politically exposed persons, also known as PEPs, heads of international organizations, and beneficial ownership information requirements for the designated non-financial businesses and professions sector. The international evaluation also noted the need to improve the number of money laundering investigations and prosecutions, in particular for more complex money laundering and terrorist financing schemes, such as third-party professional money launderers. And I'll note that they also assessed that penalties for violating our laws are neither proportionate nor dissuasive. The findings of the mutual evaluation are welcome and in many instances align with the views provided by federal partners and private sector stakeholders. Notably, views from federal partners were profiled in the National Inherent Risk Assessment that was publicly released in 2015.
Nous avons travaillé de concert avec nos partenaires afin de...
We worked with our partners in order to prepare a discussion document setting out potential areas of investigation that would allow us to improve the legislative framework in the knowledge that this parliamentary review would be taking place soon.
Described in the paper released yesterday, draw heavily from the mutual evaluation and are organized around the following 5 themes. First, legislative and regulatory gaps. Second, enhancing the exchange of information while protecting Canadians' rights. Third, strengthening intelligence capacity and enforcement, modernizing the framework and its supervision, and finally, administrative definitions and provisions. Le gouvernement a déjà commencé à agir sur la base des grandes.
The government has already started acting on these main directions set out in the document. For example, at the meeting of December 2017, the federal, provincial, and territorial ministers of finance committed to cooperating with their respective ministerial colleagues or counterparts in order to amend existing legislation to improve corporate transparency so that corporations are required to hold information on their official owners, making it possible to go through to follow the trace of doubtful transactions through various layers of opacity to end up with finding out who is the individuals who will benefit from such transactions.
And the private sector, and that parties may differ on how to strike the appropriate balance among sometimes conflicting objectives at play in this policy space. Balance must be struck among efforts to minimize burden on reporting entities who are on the front lines of the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing, how to leverage innovation to find new ways to meet obligations while reducing burden on the private sector, efforts to counter new and evolving threats, including through new measures and enhanced international standards to better protect the safety and security of Canadians, and efforts to actively protect the charter and privacy rights of Canadians by being constantly mindful of the limits and constraints that these entail. As you begin your deliberations, we also offer the perspective that not all regime improvements require legislative changes. In our discussion paper, we point to tangible examples that show new ways public and private sector partners have begun to work together to modernize our efforts and improve effectiveness. One such example is Project Protect. This is a private sector-led initiative to combat human trafficking. Partners worked within existing authorities to identify specific transaction patterns typical of human trafficking, sex crimes. This has yielded concrete results for law enforcement agencies. This model has been expanded to other types of criminality, which has led to successful investigations in respect of different types of drug trafficking. In recent weeks, FINTRAC issued a new operational alert to identify and target fentanyl trafficking. En conclusion, Monsieur le Président,
In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, it is important for Canada to remain actively engaged in the struggle against money laundering and the financing of terrorism. This means that our framework will have to continue to evolve in order to remain robust and efficient, to respond to new threats and vulnerabilities, and to respect international standards.
We've worked well and closely with domestic and international partners to assess tangible actions that will address the evolving landscape of financial crime, and we have profiled these areas for action in our discussion paper. We look forward to supporting your deliberations and receiving your assessment of our work and your priorities for action. I thank you, Mr. Chair, for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ryan. Before I turn to questions, I do recognize that this paper, the Reviewing Canada's Anti-Money Laundering and Anti-Terrorist Financing Regime, went on your website yesterday. So I don't believe members have had time to go thoroughly through that. I do know there's a lot of information in that, so we likely will, at some point after we hear from other witnesses first, likely have to ask you to come back, and I think we'll be more appropriately prepared on this particular document, because I know it raises a lot of areas. So we'll likely have to do that a little later on. So turning to, and I would say as well, just keep in mind, Members, the deadline for witnesses is a week from tomorrow. Turning to Mr. Fergus, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Ryan. I do appreciate the opportunity that you've come to help kick off our discussions on the easily, as you mentioned, the easily referenced PCML TFA. So, look, let's start off with a larger issue, given what the chair just said in terms of our ability to familiarize ourselves with the discussion paper. It would seem to me, just in a quick overview, that we really have a difficult, let's say, a difficult triangle of objectives. That is, we have an obligation for privacy rights. We have an obligation to, or we feel that we have an obligation to minimize the administrative burden, but yet we also want to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. Can we do all three? And if we can't, given the state of where things are at, how are we going to be most effective in combating money laundering and terrorist financing? What are the things that we have to do to bring ourselves up to that international level?
Thank you for this question. It really goes to the heart of the questions that confront the regime, and the balance between privacy, burden, and results is a balance that we currently strike. And I would like to emphasize that there is considerable effectiveness in the current regime in terms of deterring criminal and terrorist activity, using the financial information that is generated through this system of intelligence, and the issues that we've put forward in the discussion paper and that you'll hear from your witnesses speak to strengthening this regime, its legislation, and how the partners work together in a constantly evolving context. So we think that there are tangible actions that can help us move forward. At its base, this dynamic environment also gives us opportunities to do things better, for example, using technology. So inherently, financial intelligence is a system of transactions that can be queried, assessed, and we can learn interesting things in terms of patterns of transactions. That goes to using algorithms, that goes to all of the modern techniques that can help us make progress from using information effectively. So the question is to get a consistent and comprehensive base of information that asks the right questions and is structured in the right way so that our chain of passing that intelligence on to law enforcement in ways that can subsequently be the basis for successful prosecutions is how we see the inherent question. And I think that's what we've put forward, our best advice, and what we look forward to hearing from the committee.
Thank you. Yet the Financial Action Task Force, as you pointed out, has pointed out that yes, Canada is a strong player and is a great partner in terms of having certain elements in place, but yet there are some weaknesses or some vulnerabilities, I think, as you put it. Whether or not that is the question of the question of politically exposed persons, the question of beneficial ownership, it strikes me that more and more that if we were to drill down on beneficial ownership, that also does require. That butts up against the question of privacy. That butts up against what our international practice is, and where, how far can we go without our other partners around the world follow in lockstep with us.
Another excellent question. The international attention to money laundering and terrorist financing is active, it's robust, it is thoughtful, and it brings a high standard of excellence to these questions. The advice that we received from the FATF, it is geared towards exactly those objectives that you name: integration of global efforts, the ability to make sure that there aren't weak links in the chain in specific member countries, and the work of the FATF has provided us with tangible advice of where we should put our attention so that we can be consistent with international norms. It has prioritized the areas for action. As you say, it's the question of beneficial ownership, so that essentially bad actors cannot hide behind the corporate structure in order to move money for their ends. It goes to the question of making sure that there aren't important gaps in our regime. Subject to a Supreme Court decision in 2015, the legal sector is not currently captured in our regime. And it's important for us to be able to see the transactions that are typically used by bad actors from a holistic perspective. The exclusion of lawyers from that regime is an important gap for us, because lawyers do things like establish corporations, set up, they notarize important transactions. And that sense of there being a gap in the system gives a strategic area that criminals and those who want to move money to terrorists can and do exploit. So we have contributed to the development of these international standards. We endorse them on a very profound basis, and our partners have given us advice about where Canada should put our emphasis to be most compliant with international efforts and most effective in our domestic objectives of keeping Canadians safe and secure.
Greg, Mr. Albus.
Ms. Ryan, and I certainly appreciate the work that you do for Canadians as well as your department. I too am glad that the chair has mentioned that there will be a thorough review of the document that was posted on the website yesterday. But for our purposes today, I think you've done a very good job in just outlining some of the issues. Now, you did rightly raise that FINTRAC does have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to not non-federally regulated mortgages and whatnot. That came very clear in the housing study. Some members may remember that MP Greywall had asked a question about how certain transactions are conducted via cash, and you had the stats, and both CMHC as well as OFSI said we don't have access to that data. But there is an agency that does, and that would be FINTRAC, though it's only available on a transaction-by-transaction basis. And while I totally understand the argument about needing to make sure that people's private information is kept confidential, I believe that there is a great deal of information that could have public use if that was aggregated. So maybe not just, so while they're doing the good work that they do to ensure that transactions are not terrorist-based or organized crime, there is some social value to that aggregated data that would give us a better understanding, particularly in the areas of mortgages that are not currently under the federal regulatory space. Would you agree that there's an opportunity here for us as parliamentarians to review that end?
I agree on many elements of what you've put forward. The real estate sector is a clear area of concern within the regime. I would say that we have a series of requirements on the real estate sector currently in place. I would point in the first instance to FINTRAC's efforts to raise compliance with those existing requirements. FINTRAC is actively working with the real estate sector to make sure that they are aware of their responsibilities and they are more actively reporting to FINTRAC. In terms of how that information can better be aggregated and assessed in terms of blind spots and areas of concern, that's that stems from that first effort to get the information flowing into FinTrack and having it complete. On the completeness side, we do know that we don't have the entire real estate sector covered. And so to the extent that we can capture the transactions of interest, all of the transactions that you flagged as being of interest, especially anything to do with cash is always concerning, then that'll set us up to have that better aggregation from a better base.
Yes, because right now FinTrack's legislation doesn't allow it to aggregate the information that it collects. And again, I do appreciate your point that we need to be working off of capturing all the information to have an effective regime. But again, and I will quote many of the realtors I've met with, FinTrack is a pain in the you-know-what. They don't like doing the paperwork. They understand why they have to do it. And I think that many people would be glad, or at least would feel better knowing that information is not only keeping Canadians safe, but is actually giving policy decision makers better information. And so I really would hope that you would run that up the flagpole with both FinTrack as well as with the minister, because I do think there's a real opportunity for us to start utilizing that data. Now, I do agree with your point, though, that it is a serious concern when the court has basically exempted a large area. We have many lawyers who's either come to this committee or I'm not sure if we have a lawyer here, but that again would probably agree that there needs to be a better balance than the one that exists today. So I certainly appreciate that. Now, you mentioned things like beneficial ownership. I'm glad the government is looking to view this, because I think that's an area. In a recent speech to Transparency International, BC's new Attorney General, Mr. Eby, stated that he'd been made aware of serious, and I'm quote, serious large-scale transnational laundering of the proceeds of crime in British Columbia's casinos. So to the best of your knowledge, is that true? And if so, what's being done to combat it?
Thank you very much. We also read the Attorney General's speech closely, and we're quite concerned with the number of challenges that he's set forth. FinTrack has been working closely with the casino sector, and in particular in British Columbia, to trace through the charges that have been put in terms of what's happening in the province, and I think, defer to my FinTrack colleagues to take you through those efforts. It is a serious area of concern, and
BC specific problem in your view, or do you think that this is more of an issue right across the country or in certain hotspots?
I would say that the sector has been consistently marked as an area of concern, and there are efforts to make sure that it's fully compliant with the requirements of the regime, and that appropriate efforts are put in place to follow up on the issue.
Okay. So I will have some more specific questions at another time, Mr. Chair, but I just want to finish with that, many Canadians send money abroad. Oftentimes it's to family members in other countries. I just want to know if you would also include within the current proposal to look at some of our money laundering, because we have to tighten up our own regime within Canada, and I'm not driving aspersions to any one particular group, but a lot of money does leave Canada, and I want to know if the government is keen also to ensure that we are not facilitating another country's problems, and that we are ensuring that there are some controls on money exiting Canada, not just entering it.
Short answer is absolutely. That speaks to the integration across international efforts to make sure that we have consistent systems, and we put a lot of attention on those type of transactions, both through the formal sector of financial institutions as well as the sector of money service businesses. You will see considerable attention to the money service business sector in the various reviews that have been done in our paper, and we absolutely think that that's a balance that has always got to be on the front burner and to get right.
Thank you both. And just on that exchange, FinTrack is scheduled to be before committee next Wednesday.
I just want to make sure they come prepared, Mr. Chair,
That's,
so that they know that we're going to be asking some questions that perhaps, and again, to be fair to them, they're only going to say this is what the law says we can do. And, you know, these people are going to be making suggestions to our elected, the people in those offices, like the Minister of Finance, as to what might be reasonable to look at. So I'm taking that opportunity.
good exchange. Mr. Dussault.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci à vous pour...
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for coming to this first meeting dealing with the subject. I don't like to work for nothing. I like to see results of this work. So my first question to you is a follow-up on the last two reports that were published in 2006 and 2013, where there were 18 recommendations. The other contained 16, if I remember correctly. I'd like to know whether you've had any indication about the type of progress achieved in implementing these various recommendations. It would be interesting for the committee to have this information so we could know whether these studies did have a follow-up. We're conducting this same review here, and I wouldn't like it to be in vain. So I'd like to know whether we could have information about the progress that has been achieved so far on these various recommendations contained in the last two reports.
De vous fournir une réponse plus précise.
In order to give you a more precise answer, I'll continue in English.
A summary in the discussion paper that describes recent efforts to evolve the regime. A number of those legislative and regulatory changes responded to the last parliamentary review. The Senate study included a number of recommendations in respect of the operation of the regime as well. I would say that in many cases we took on board the objective of that advice. In practice, the implementation of those objectives may have been different for different government realities and so on. I would also say, Mr. Chair, that we are working quite hard to provide the committee with a number of additional background documents, chronologies, summaries of changes to the regime through time pour mieux vous soutenir dans vos efforts pour que vous...
In order to support our efforts so that your work does not come to naught. That is encouraging then for the committee. I think it would be useful for us to obtain information on what progress has been achieved, the most recent changes to the law and the regulations that have been enacted. I have some questions about more precise matters. You talk about the ultimate beneficiary or the beneficial owner, and it was important to have such information made available. If a government agency requires this information, if this information is not provided to the public, unfortunately. You also talked about tax havens, and I'd like to know whether you consider this to be one of the major problems in this struggle against money laundering and terrorist financing using the proceeds of crime. There are a number of jurisdictions, several jurisdictions throughout the world that do have very strict financial secrecy. And there are jurisdictions that are extremely opaque, where it is impossible to obtain information. So I'd like to know to what extent you consider this to be a problem. That is the ability to obtain data and information that is necessary to know who is really behind a particular business or organized criminal group. Do you consider this to be a serious problem that should be dealt with as part of our study? Thank you for your question. The short answer then would be yes.
find out who is behind a corporation as one of the more significant priority areas for action in the Canadian landscape in respect of money laundering, terrorist financing, and tax evasion. This is a view that is evidently shared by all of our provincial and territorial partners. We were very pleased with the dedication and seriousness that our provincial and territorial partners have brought to our working groups that were kicked off with our last budget process and have proceeded over the last number of months. And this is evident in the agreement that provinces and territories reached at the finance minister's table in December, in concert with ministers responsible for corporate statutes, in their ministries, to bring changes to the relevant statutes to make it be the case that corporations must hold that information. They've also agreed to eliminate the bearer shares that aren't registered, which is an important issue as well. So it speaks to the importance that all jurisdictions attach to these problems and the priority to act on it. You raise an additional question, which is the availability of this information to be assessed by the public. And this is an issue that we will continue to study with our provincial and territorial and other federal partners, following the important first step of bringing harmonization to the requirement that all corporations should keep records as to who is their beneficial owner. We will continue our discussions and deliberations with our partners in terms of the merits of a registry, the best modality of a registry, and the difficult question of whether it should be made public or accessible by the appropriate law enforcement agencies and CRA. So I offer that. Hope it answers your question.
C'est bon, c'est très intéressant. Puis,
Yes, very good. It's interesting. I think it's a good idea that we would be heading in that direction eventually, because Canada is considered to be one of the least open companies with respect to financial transparency, particularly corporate transparency. There are certain practices then that do make a situation easy for corporations. The costs are low and the formalities are very simple. It may be an advantage in some cases, but there is a high level of secrecy, and I think that there were provinces that did hesitate before the idea of making such information available, and this is like creating a sort of haven for corporations that may not be as well-intentioned as we would hope, and are attracted to Canada for that particular reason. Also, the administrative monetary penalties in the case of FINTRAC. Can we expect then that this their program review will produce something? Because there was a ruling by a court of justice that it was not considered to be excessive, and there was so much opacity in the way in which these amounts were determined that the judges said that it did not make any sense. These penalties did not seem to be based on anything objective. Yeah.
The issue of administrative monetary penalties is under active discussion, especially at FINTRAC, but with other partners. And at its core is a tension between effectiveness and discretion versus rules, essentially. So the issue is whether FINTRAC can achieve better success by working with entities towards compliance and the right point at which to apply administrative penalties and with what amount, with the question of the appropriate channels for due process to be followed, are what I would describe as the key elements in that discussion, but we are seized with getting the balance right and getting a regime in place that will hit that right balance between effectiveness and transparency and compliance.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. Just on the recommendations in the Senate report, I'd asked this of a financial department representative before. I'm told it is hard to respond directly to each recommendation, but if you could, on Pierre's question, if you could link as closely as possible what's been done on those recommendations, I think it would be helpful to the committee so that we're not retilling the same ground, if I could put it that way. Mr. Francesco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I welcome everyone. Bienvenue. Sorry, quick question. In doing our preliminary reading, and I think many of us, all of us on the committee, are going to be doing a lot of reading in the next couple of weeks. The Library of Parliament provided a really good chart of all the agencies, be it federal, provincial, majority on the federal side. Everybody from CBSA to CSIS, CSE, CRA. A lot of resources and very large bureaucracies, of course. And it's great to see that there are a lot of resources dedicated to a very important issue with regards to money laundering and terrorist financing. But it was interesting because yesterday CMHC came out with a report, and it's about 225 pages. And I read some of the headlines, and part of the report dealt with foreign purchases of housing here in Canada, and kind of tiptoeing off of what Mr. Albus was saying and what the concerns out in BC specifically. There were concerns about we cannot track nor identify when foreign investors purchase homes in Canada, the source of their funds. And I'm going to read to you just the Globe and Mail tidbit from the article that was posted yesterday. The Law Society of BC, I'll go to quotation marks, the Law Society of BC told CMHC that much of the information lawyers had on the identity of foreign buyers and the source of funds used for home purchases was covered by privacy laws. Lawyers have also been given exemption to the requirement to report financial transactions of more than $10,000 to FinTrack, which tracks money laundering. So with this very large, or this large set of bureaucracy here, that literally tens of millions of dollars of taxpayer money is being used at a very granular micro level, we can't even track and we can't identify the source of funds that's being used to purchase real estate in Canada by foreign investors, which I like. I love foreign investment, but we don't know. We don't know where the money's coming from. Is that a correct statement?
The issue of real estate and the various themes that you've put forward are really at the crux of some of the more difficult and important issues that we hope to move forward with this review and subsequent legislative changes. If I may, the issues that you spoke to include the inclusion of lawyers in the regime and the ability to assess the beneficial owners of a corporation. Corporations have been cited in a number of studies of real estate transactions. On the issue of lawyers, you quite rightly point out that lawyers are responsible for a number of financial type of transactions that in other countries are parsed between the aspect of solicitor-client privilege versus that which is more transactional and of the nature that's covered by FinTrack and those reporting requirements. So I would agree with the member that these are issues that relate to serious problems that speak to our deeply held objectives. In terms of the question of real estate specifically, I would point to efforts by our colleagues at FinTrack to work closely with the real estate associations and the industry to flag to them their responsibilities to be on the lookout for suspicious transactions that speak to knowing their client. That's a fundamental principle in this space. And looking for that which is a suspicious transaction. And that speaks to the questions like the source of funds, the nature of the transaction, and so on. So I would say that these are issues at the core of what the committee has struck for itself as its mandate, and on all fronts, I would say that we agree that the problems are serious. The efforts that are being put to these questions are comprehensive. There are a lot of resources at play. There are additional resources at play in the private sector, and the ability to have the most comprehensive and targeted regime to address these problems is, I think, a shared objective of all of us here today.
Okay, thank you. Can I follow up? The source of funds is, very important for my residents. People go to work every morning, they save their money to make a down payment on a home. The idea that foreigners or people coming from other parts of the world can come here, purchase a house, don't have to disclose the source of their funds, or are protected from that, while Canadians work hard, save their money to purchase a home. To me, there seems to be something offside. Regarding beneficial ownership, and I do agree, we do need to move forward in a manner that is a balance where there's a protection between privacy and disclosure. My personal feeling, maybe it'll change during the tenure of this study, is that the pertinent authorities should have the right for disclosure, but the general public may, in my view, not so. I would like to just hear some brief comments in terms of what other jurisdictions are doing on beneficial ownership, in terms of protecting the rights of people that do undertake risk and invest and create wealth versus their rights to privacy.
Okay. So thank you for this question. The issue of beneficial ownership is an important one, and we think that, to reiterate this, the point of having corporations in the first instance keep basic records in a standardized way that can be used by law enforcement entities or provided to financial institutions as current requirements exige that they require for those corporations to have access to the financial sector is simply an important first step that will allow us to have that discussion. I would describe the issue of beneficial ownership internationally as being a quickly evolving field, and that many countries are taking efforts to increase their requirements to have beneficial ownership be provided either to law enforcement agencies or through public registries. I might turn to my colleague Ian, who's more active in the international space, to speak to which countries, and we can certainly follow up with a summary to the chair.
So I think if you look at the international experience, the UK is kind of held up as the gold standard right now. They have a public registry of what they call people with significant control, and that's a statutory requirement for corporations, but also shareholders, to report in their ownership above a certain threshold. The European Commission has a directive which also requires that their countries have and create registries as well, and are moving towards public registries themselves. I think ours, as Annette had pointed out, we're making those steps forward. The Americans are also bringing in similar sorts of moves now to try and create requirements on FIs to collect and to collect beneficial ownership information. I think what you look at in terms of the international world, though, are within the FATF, there's 37 countries that are involved, but we also have this network of FATF-style regional bodies, which covers some 190 countries. And I think, as you're all well aware, it's some of those international financial centers are where some of the challenges come from. And I think that's where the value of the FATF and ourselves as active participants within FATF to work with these regional bodies and to apply the type of peer pressure that will enable us to build a good global network and to deal with this, because it is a global issue. We know that. We've seen complicated structures within corporations, and it requires a good international effort across all of those groups.
Both, Mr. Albus.
Actually,
We're going to 5-minute rounds.
Yeah, I just wanted to go and continue along the same thrust as the previous member. You mentioned significant control. So in my mind, there are certain cases where it would be helpful for people in positions of authority or the general public. Again, I'm not going to establish which one should have it right now on the beneficial ownership side. But then if you have a case where someone is leasing, has a lease to operate a particular business, so that in my knowledge, in Canada, there's no formal lease registry. So someone could, for example, own a gas station, but then lease out the ability to operate it to someone who may be involved in organized crime and may then use those operations. So is that the kind of situations you're talking about of some sort of registry for significant control?
So in the first instance, the efforts are focused on beneficial ownership of a corporation. And we have different thresholds and concepts at play in different federal and provincial statutes right now. At the federal level, under the PCML-TFA, the level of control is 25%, and that differs by province or territory, and under the Federal Corporations Act. To answer your question about leasing, I would point to there being a range of legal relationships and entities that have been identified as being subject to the possibility for manipulation that you name. And that could include trusts, it could include partnerships, or any number of other transactions. We are mindful of that wide sweep of relationships, and have taken steps in the trust space to build transparency and so on. In terms of the specific issue of leasing, I think I'll propose that we get back to the committee, and Maxime will answer.
I would just add the point that just to build on an answer that Annette provided previously, under the PCML-TFA, reporting entities have obligations to know their customer. So the type of work that is happening on beneficial ownership in this particular instance would be to try to understand who owns the corporation. But as the operator of that particular corporation, establishing a business relationship with a reporting entity, it would be incumbent upon the reporting entity to know its customer and get a good understanding of what their business is, including who the principals are. So in that sense, like in this particular setting, the bank, for example, should have a good understanding of who's involved in the business. It's a bridge further to try to get better information on the beneficial owner, in this case, the owner of the corporation.
Yeah, but again, and I don't, because I know there's a bit of a rabbit hole when we talk about these issues, but again, if someone owns an asset and then makes a lease that is not registered anywhere to someone else, and that someone else is operating that asset in a way that is used as a way to launder money, we're not going to know about that because there is no formal registry. And so I do understand that we are in a world where we are coming to terms with many of these arrangements. And so things like beneficial ownership and significant control are relatively, scattered terms through and trying to bring some consistency with international standards is difficult. But I do think perhaps that might be one area that the government may be wanting to investigate whether or not, because again, if you make a change, then organized crime will make changes to their behaviors to structure their affairs in a way that is compliant but allows them to continue their opportunities. So I'd like to just to switch gears, though. In your consultation paper, it's stated that the FATS or FATS report notes that making the penalties for violating anti-money laundering laws more proportionate and dissuasive would assist in the deterrence of money laundering and terrorist financing, end quote. So what stronger penalties do you think would be appropriate in this regard?
Ian is closer to this one. I'll turn to you.
So I think the view right now, if you look at the offences, when people are being prosecuted for money laundering, terrorist financing, they tend to be concurrent sentences, and they tend to be of a term that's equivalent to the underlying predicate crimes. And I think one of the challenges and one of the areas that we're working with our law enforcement colleagues and our prosecution colleagues is the difficulty. ML is a very difficult crime to investigate and to prosecute, and I think what the FATF felt is that at times there was cases where there was, the ML charges would be dropped for the pursuit of the underlying predicate crimes, which puts people away, gets the bad guys put behind bars over a suitable time. So I think, as Maxime would be able to talk to, there are some discussions within the paper about trying to address some of these issues with regards to the prosecution and the law enforcement.
Could, Mr. Chair, add one specific point, which is that we've done an operational review of our effectiveness of the regime, and we see a need to address the standard of prosecution in this space. Mm-hmm. Right now, we require the standard of proof to tie the money launderer to the discrete knowledge of the predicate crime. We would like to see that standard changed to be a standard of recklessness, that there's reason to believe that the money is associated with crime or terrorism.
Thank you.
Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you. The 2014 BIA gave FINTRAC the responsibility of public awareness campaigns to help deal with terrorism financing. Have you seen any areas of improvement or success, or are there things that we need to continue to look at, or have you seen tangible results since the public awareness campaign, or has it caused any kind of additional issues that have been brought up?
Thank you for the question. I think our colleagues at FINTRAC would be very happy to speak to their efforts in the public awareness space. It is an important activity that FINTRAC undertakes, and they have been making progress on any number of areas to bring a wider swath of Canadians, particularly those that are reporting entities, into a more active awareness of the value of the information that they may have through their transactions.
Okay, fair enough. I can ask that when they appear. You touched on the gaps in the politically exposed persons. Could you maybe clarify a little bit on the gaps that we need to be looking at?
I'd be happy to. So the concept of politically exposed persons is a concept that was developed at the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, and it speaks to a specific risk of money laundering and terrorist financing in the space particularly of corruption. And this is an aspect that plays to both the international integration of standards and laws, as well as domestic objectives of making sure that that corruption in particular is kept in check. I'd start with the observance that happily Canada is a country that has some of the lowest incidence of corruption in the world. We rank as ninth in a standard of some 170 countries when it comes to not having corruption as an issue. But the aspect of identifying people as politically exposed persons, which goes from in Canada, the Governor General to mayors right now, or the heads of international organizations, speaks to the financial institutions, reporting entities, having the right information in the transactions that they survey to be able to pick up patterns that relate to corruption in particular. So the standards are there to essentially have an information base that can allow the identification of that particular stream of transactions that are problematic, more so in other parts of the world than Canada, but as part of that integration and as a domestic objective, it's information that's pertinent and therefore part of the regime.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the beneficial ownership question, and it was stated that the UK and European Commission tend to be at a gold standard. It seems that based on the conversation here that part of the issue is really around lawyers, and that seems to be a big gap in opportunity, and I understand that there was a court case that allowed for some of this, but the UK doesn't have that different of a legal system, and so I guess obviously laws are different, but I guess I'm curious if the department, or if maybe this is a better question for Justice, but are we looking at what is the legal framework in the UK that kind of meets that test with the privacy laws that they would also have that can help close this gap? Because again, they're not completely dissimilar in terms of their legal system. So why is it something that their rule of law can accommodate, but ours seems to be missing? Or is it language or process that needs to be better addressed that we can look at?
It's a great question. We're working very hard on that question with Justice and other partners. We are looking at other international examples that could shed light on how we could structure our response to that court case. And yet the Supreme Court cited Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, we do need to find a made-in-Canada solution, but our stated intention is to find a legal solution that will work in the Canadian context and have similarities to the structure and objectives of other countries.
It just hasn't been brought up yet, but cryptocurrencies, I think it's going to be a big area and component of the study as well, and I assume that somewhat fits into your comments about innovation. You're talking about innovation on the side of monitoring, but I think this committee can somewhat agree that we need to also look at the innovation on the criminal activity side. Even if cryptocurrencies might not have been established solely for that, it seems to be a very welcome place for that activity. Do you have any comments or suggestions in terms of how we try to scope cryptocurrency and our study of that?
Another great question, Mr. Chair. The issue of cryptocurrencies, virtual digital currencies, is one that's under careful study in the AML-TF space. If I may, I would make perhaps 3 points. So the first is that we have been taking steps, and we've noted our intention to bring forth regulations in respect of dealers in virtual currency, so that we can reestablish the level playing field in that space in the sense of how money service businesses transact, as the member said, across borders and so on. So there is work coming forward shortly that will address that specific space. A second point that I would say is that the innovation in this space has both risks and challenges. So the inherent challenge is the anonymity of the currencies and the the requirement to meet requirements to not have anonymity. To know your customer is an inherent tension between how the new technology is being used and the regime. So that's something that we are actively mindful of and watching carefully. That said, I think that the technology has another potential that has been flagged to have the record of who is behind what transactions. That has an area of discussion around it called RegTech. And in this space, the question is being posed as to whether you could, in a sense, build in the requirements to know your customer and make sure that transactions are compliant with the objectives and strictures of the regime, so that, as these technologies evolve, maybe we can lighten our requirements on the private sector and have that innovation, move to a place that can bring all the benefits that are promised, as well as build in the important safeguards that the space concerns itself with.
Thank you. We're well over that round. Mr. Albus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just continuing on some of the conversations earlier, Ms. Ryan, you alluded to that regimes like the politically exposed persons seems to be working rather well. I opened up a self-directed TFSA using a virtual bank here in Canada, and was interested to see that they followed procedures to make sure that elected officials like myself, though I wouldn't say I have nothing bigger than my soapbox as far as to shake my fist at the government. It's good to know, though, that those systems are in play and that there's a checklist that they go down to, so Canadians know that regardless, their elected officials are subject to a higher threshold. So I appreciate that. But it also got me thinking that there are other people, or I should say other companies, that are operating in certain spaces. For example, obviously the CRA has asked PayPal for a bunch of information because they may believe that there may be some tax evasion. Has your department also looked at the payment space, so to speak, that are non-traditional, like PayPal or other groups, to see if there is use of that space for money laundering?
Thank you for the question. So there's different concepts in the question that you put forth. So on one hand, it's the politically exposed persons and the requirements that we place on reporting entities to know your client and track the transactions against who the client is, to be able to identify what is suspicious in the eyes of the regime. The second part of your question, if I could, spoke to companies like PayPal that are more in the money service business space in terms of how the Act and the regime, view reporting entities. And, I'd say that the short answer is that we want to have that consistency and comprehensiveness in terms of how various reporting entities, be they the banks, insurance companies, money service businesses, or other types of firms.
Prepaid credit cards, for example?
That also speaks to the margin that we try and keep current in terms of the types of transactions that we capture in the regime. So as you have more innovation in both the number of players and the types of transactions that people do, then that speaks to the needs to keep all of our regime current internationally, domestically, and and part of the work that we welcome from the committee to make sure we're up to current techniques.
So you've said that we are trying to do a Made in Canada approach, while kind of trying to I would hope that we're trying to be leaders in terms of working with the international community. Is there any particular countries you might cite as being a good example that Canada can say, here's some good work that's been done here? Perhaps we could look at that and see how that would fit into a Canadian context. Is there any particular regimes you think that Canada, or do you think that we seem to be leading the field? I'm a big believer that you can, see what other regimes offer.
Absolutely. In terms of areas where Canada has shown leadership, I think that the example of Project Protect is important for how the regimes continue to evolve. So the idea of having an understanding of the patterns of specific transaction flows related with very narrow types of crime or so on, and then feeding that back to the information in a way that protects the privacy of Canadians, is a space that there is a lot of innovation, and there is a lot of Canadian-led innovation. That said, we absolutely can always learn from other countries, and I think that there's any number of examples you could look to, but the UK is, as the other member said, quite like Canada, and they are innovating in a number of ways that we're watching closely. They have a variant of Project Protect, Project Gimlet, that I think the committee will find insights and other countries that are also active in the space and have learnings for Canada would include Australia, New Zealand, like us. The Americans are active. Any number of partners have their own innovations, but those are closest to the Canadian model, I would say.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. The United Kingdom, I think, has a lot, especially when it deals with cyber crimes and whatnot. So I'm glad to see that we are checking with people that have similar values, but also face similar conditions. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Add something?
Well, I guess I would just add that we're very active. The genesis of the FATF comes out of the G7 in the late 80s. And we are still very active. We meet regularly with our G7 colleagues because we do share a very common interest in all this, and those discussions are very active. We also have discussions regularly with our Five Eyes colleagues as well. So we do try to ensure that we can, get like-minded people together in the room to try and provide some direction to where FATF is going.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Graywall. And then Mr. Dezeau.
Thank you for the witnesses for coming today. How big of a problem is money laundering in Canada, and how many cases have actually made it to court, and how many people have been convicted in, let's say, the last decade or so?
In terms of a specific number to cite, there have been different attempts to put a specific figure on money laundering. Those figures can be in the range of, I think I've seen 5 billion, 20 billion, but inherently we don't know kind of what we don't know. If we could identify the money laundering, then the efforts are to detect and deter and detect. So it is large, it is significant, and it is a threat. We have published a National Inherent Risk Assessment that attempts to speak in more qualitative sense to the nature of the threat and how pervasive it is. So I would refer you to that work. In terms of the prosecutions, the numbers are relatively low when it comes to the money laundering and terrorist financing space in terms of what people often, I think, expect. Ian spoke earlier to the findings of the Financial Action Task Force that pointed to a dynamic that often the law enforcement entities will use financial information that is surfaced through the regime to identify the predicate crimes. And then they will often prosecute the underlying predicate crime rather than necessarily the money laundering or terrorist financing offense. So I would offer that as an alternate aspect of what success looks like.
Yeah, because the question goes that there's $70 million, looks like annually, that's funded to the organizations that track money laundering and anti-terrorist financing.
Mm-hmm.
So as a policymaker, the natural question is, well, what is the return on investment?
Mm-hmm.
How much money is actually being recouped from the financial markets? How many cases are we taking to court? How many people are charged with these offenses? Because in the grand scheme, on a macro level, I don't think anybody's going to argue with you on the need for protection, especially in the global environment that we live in. But there's got to be concrete returns in Canada to ensure that we're on the right line. My second question is that the $10,000 cash limit that you can carry between the U.S. and Canada, that limit got set decades ago. And I guess now, in your report here, it says that we have to have harsher penalties on undisclosed cash. But is there any discussion on raising the limit, because the limit seems to represent an era, like maybe, I don't know, it was set in like the early 90s, I think.
I would describe the $10,000 limit as always subject to discussion, but not an area that we have received a lot of feedback compared to other areas for reform in the regime.
Because my question is this, is that every transaction in any bank in Canada that's over 10,000 gets flagged by FINTRAC. Mm-hmm. So that's got to be thousands of transactions on a daily basis, I would assume. I used to work as a corporate lawyer on Bay Street, and we were always dealing in the hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars in wire transfers. So how much resources does FINTRAC have to actually go after each little $10,000 transaction? And if I'm money laundering, I'm not doing transactions in the millions to catch attention. I'm doing them at the $10,000, $15,000 limit. Mm-hmm. In order to actually get away with it.
Yeah. So I would respond to your question in two directions. So the first would be to speak to efforts that we have underway with the private sector to not just focus on the specific dollar limit, but find ways that we can focus on the truly suspicious transactions. So that speaks to understanding the typologies of crime, money laundering, terrorist financing, and finding ways to turn that back into actionable algorithms and practices that will sift through the haystack and find the needles. So, as you say, the number of transactions in Canada that exceed $10,000 are, really quite vast. So that question of, well, how can we focus on what is important is one of the higher level questions that is before us and that we are undertaking with private sector colleagues, and I'm quite certain they will bring forward when they come. Sorry.
Thank you very much. My last question is on digital currency, and I think that we're behind the pendulum here. Billions of dollars of wealth has been created in the cryptocurrency space. Our government, our country, a lot of Western countries are slow to regulate it, really don't understand what it is. If you read a lot of the opinion articles on the internet in established sources, a lot of it has to do with money laundering. Like, people in the black market are trying to legitimize their wealth by coming into the crypto space. What are we doing from a regulation perspective to track this, A, and B, to counter it and see how we can actually stop money laundering in the cryptocurrency space, because it is the next big thing, and we can't be this slow to evolve because the innovation is just changing on a daily basis.
I appreciate the question. It is, again, another one of the higher level questions that stands before us. We've spoken to efforts that we will be bringing forth in coming months in terms of regulating virtual currency dealers. The question of how to put in place the requirements that mean that transactions entering the Canadian financial system are not anonymous and do allow us to meet our Know Your Customer and identify what is suspicious is an active area for all of the regime, and we are seized by it. We share your concerns as you've described very well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raj. Mr. Duceau.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to come back to what was said previously when we attempted to find out more information about various patterns rather than setting a specific figure, $10,000. And this is what would trigger a check in most cases. In most cases where, in fact, since problems do not arise that frequently. So I think it is important to have a system that detects or that raises a red flag. For example, some regular transactions between two entities. The fact that transactions may be $9,900 quite regularly between such entities. Is this your objective then, rather than attempting to set a precise amount, finding what the general patterns are?
Oui, absolument.
Yes, definitely.
The question of not what is a transaction that is above or below $10,000, but rather what is a suspicious transaction. And that goes to, a profound set of guidance to reporting entities of what they should consider to be suspicious based on their knowledge of their client. And so, I would offer the committee that, we don't have a specific focus on $10,000 plus or minus, but rather the pattern of transactions that would raise concerns. And that question of being ever more precise and practical and tangible in terms of the guidance that we give to reporting entities is something that we're seized with. The question of structured transactions that are meant to fall below the radar, below $10,000, we also have advice in our paper that would give us better tools to identify that effort to go below the transaction. The term is smurfing, to take a large transaction and turn it into a series of small transactions that would evade the objectives of the Act. So yes, we want to focus on the suspect transactions more so than the amount. And yes, we also want to make sure that we're not creating blind spots with that threshold, but it's a question of magnitude.
Sur mon autre question, peut-être sur les, par curiosité un peu surtout.
Out of curiosity, another question here. And also with respect to transparency, I think that there is interest in knowing what is done with the proceeds of crime. Of course, we're interested in seeing that the system functions, but proceeds of crime are seized, confiscated in various cases. So we're curious to know what happens, where this money ends up. Is it used to fund the system? I was just curious to know.
The discussion with the honourable member. So it's a mixed answer. At the federal level, proceeds of crime captured and seized through money laundering, is in the order of $30 or $40 million in any given year. There is an overlay with the provincial and territorial responsibilities for forfeiture that is separate, and it's more in the predicate crime space. So I would answer it that way. In terms of does the money flow back to the regime? Yes, but indirectly. It flows into the Central Revenue Fund of the government, which is then the basis for departmental budgets and so on. Is there a dedicated fund? No. It's a problematic concept in that the funds in any given year might exceed or fall short of what the regime would need, and on balance we would prefer to get the resources right for the purpose rather than tie it to seizures in any given year.
Just before I turn to Greg on that point, you said, and where does the money flow to? You said earlier something along these lines that rather than prosecuting or seizing the proceeds of crime, there's other underlying issues rather than money laundering itself. Is part of the reason for that because it's police of other jurisdictions than federal that are involved. And if you go to the proceeds of crime, then that's going to head towards federal coffers. If you prosecute under something else, it's likely going to be at provincial coffers or municipal, where they've to a great extent done the work. Is there problems there?
I wouldn't think so, Mr. Chair. I think that the distinction that we spoke to earlier about how law enforcement agencies decide to prosecute the ensemble of evidence and actions that they have before them speaks more to the ability to get a conviction. And for that reason, we would like to strengthen the ability for law enforcement agencies to pursue money laundering offenses by changing the standard of proof. We think that's just a good piece of advice to follow through. But I would offer that the idea of, what's the return on investment of prosecuting one way or another is something that I wouldn't see as a problem. I would say that FINTRAC, RCMP, and law enforcement agencies do have a high level of collaboration, and I would think that they can speak in further detail to this.
I think if you, I've talked to some former chiefs of police in fairly large jurisdictions, and they would differ with that opinion. And maybe we need to talk to them as well, because the financial matters at the municipal level on this issue, I do believe, come into play, but that's something we'll hear more about. Second issue that I wanted to ask on prior to Greg is Mr. Beaupre, you talked about that the banks, whoever, there's the effort to know your customer. Do you think that really is happening in today's age? I mean, if you have a business now or a mortgage, you probably haven't been into the bank for I don't know how many years from the time you set it up. And I find in dealing with the banks, if you do business with a bank in Prince Edward Island, the decision's really made in an office in Toronto or elsewhere, Halifax or Toronto when you're from where I live. And do you really think they know their customer now?
I would say that the modalities through which the reporting entities implement their Know Your Customer obligations will vary based on the type of business that they conduct, their size. In our regime, we have 30,000 reporting entities. Some of them are the largest banks in the country that you are well aware of. Other reporting entities are, a few people operations. So definitely the way that they structure their business to understand their clients and the purpose of the business relationship are going to differ. I would argue that for the same reason, because of this variety of models, the reporting entities have various levels of awareness as to their obligations to know their customers. On the one hand, I would argue that the largest financial institutions are quite sophisticated in their approach to know their customers, and it is both about when they onboard a new client, and you're right, nowadays not only you may not go often in a branch, but you may not even have to go in a branch to open an account with an institution. Like we've put flexibilities in the regime so that the reporting entities are able to onboard clients in what we call non-face-to-face environments, while still having measures in place to get a good understanding of who is their client, so verifying identity, for example. Also, documenting what is the purpose of the account, and if we're talking about an account opening. And so not only reporting entities have obligations at the outset of a relationship, but throughout that relationship. That is what we call ongoing monitoring. And it's to that process. And again, reporting entities have different modalities to implement that. Large banks will have sophisticated systems in place to detect if there are strange patterns emerging that are not consistent with what they were told the account was for. If I'm giving an example, but if a client says I'm opening an account for savings for my grandchild, studies, and then there's a large velocity of transaction happening to that account, like a bank through systems would find this quite unusual and may decide to investigate and document, what is happening. At the other extreme, if we're talking very small entities, they have a more personal relationship with their clients, and they may have other means to see if there's a problem in what they think they know about their client and what is actually happening with the consumption of the services they offer.
Thank you. Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup, M. Beaupré. Ça ouvre une...
Thank you, Mr. Beaupré. I think this opens up an important distinction between knowing and understanding your client. That it does depend to a large extent on the size of the financial institution. I'd like to put a few questions to Ms. Ryan.
Used by criminals to conceal or disguise origins of criminal proceeds to make them appear as if they originated from legitimate sources. So that's great, but I'm trying to figure out then if our focus is on knowing our clients. It seems to me that the definition of money laundering or any anti-money laundering efforts that we'd want to take on would require us to want to know the provenance, the sources of those funds. Am I missing the point, or is that correct?
You're correct. I mean, that is the overarching objective of the regime. So knowing the client is an inherent part of that logic of how do you assess whether there is sufficient suspicion that the provenance of the funds may be of interest.
That retired teacher in Summerside shouldn't be having $300,000 going through their account on a regular basis.
There's a range of advice that FINTRAC has compiled and shares with reporting entities about what constitutes suspicious transactions, but you've got it right. That's the inherent logic.
So then back to some questions that my colleagues had asked, that what type of ways can we strengthen the regime so that we would be able to track not only to know our clients in Canada, but to know non-Canadians who are investing here, to know the provenance of the sources of their incomes. Mm-hmm. What kind of efforts are underway on that in that regard on an international coordinative level, if any?
Mm-hmm. So that's very much a focus of the regime, and there is existing advice on that. I think that it's a space that we could make better progress, especially with our private sector entities, in terms of being able to have a more nuanced identification of suspicious clients and transactions among regime partners. So to the extent that the international and intentionally, complex and opaque transactions would require a series of transactions and events and actions to come together. Being able to bring that information together from different sources in a more fluid, robust, practical way is part of the way forward to do just what you say.
So, again, so then, in that regard, we would want to make sure, I imagine any efforts that we would want to make, it's much better for us to prevent and having funds originating from undesirable sources. It's better to enact measures to prevent that whatever funds come into the Canadian financial system are legitimate, not being used for money laundering, not used for proceeds from crime, or not used for terrorist fundraising, right? So I'm just trying to figure out in the I guess the recipe that we have of terms of activities that we could do. One is prevention, one is of course detection, the other one is prosecution, or disrupting, I should say. Are we putting enough efforts in the prevention to make sure that the money that comes into the system is legitimate?
I would point to the evaluation of the Financial Action Task Force to say that, on balance, the Canadian regime and efforts are effective. I think that it is a difficult space, it is an evolving space, and we do have advice of how to do better in that space. The international piece of it is difficult. We do have requirements that require somebody who's moving money into the Canadian system to do their due diligence, to understand their customers, the institutions, and so on that they're dealing with, so that that provenance of funds is as compliant as it can possibly be. We hope to tighten that. We hope to improve it. But my summary would be yes. That's very much the focus of how we want to move the regime forward.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Dussault, and then back to Mr. McLeod.
Juste une question assez rapide, mais...
A fairly quick question. I'm not quite sure what the answer might be. It may be out of the box, but if we consider that cryptocurrencies another problem might be, of course, that cash in the system. It is possible to have large sums of cash, and this can enable anonymity. I'd like to know whether you've given any thought to this in the long term, whether this is something that you might be giving consideration to. If there are no more cash transactions, then of course that might deal with part of the problem. Yes, I agree with you.
Challenge for the regime. It is inherently anonymous, and the ability to track cash going across borders, the ability to withdraw cash that may be falling into misuse is an important challenge, and we bring forward advice about that question. And it is a nice parallel to some of the challenges for the emerging technologies. So that aspect of anonymity and being able to move funds either to finance terrorist activities or move funds that flow from criminal activities, and and essentially increase the reward to crime in terms of what it can purchase and how transparently is inherent to the challenge in front of the regime. We've spoken to some of the risks of these new technologies, but also the potential to build in new safeguards into the technologies as they emerge, and as digital means have the potential to replace cash going forward. Je suis d'accord.
Okay, Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the presenters today. This subject is certainly broad and very complex, and there's a lot of information that's been provided that I'm still struggling to digest. Your presentation today was very helpful. I appreciate it very much. There is some questions that I have, though. The subject that Mr. Gorwell raised on the $10,000 threshold is not clear to me. There's already reporting entities that are required to exercise discretion by flagging the transactions below the thresholds. Could you tell me if you believe that the existing threshold of $10,000 is effective and an efficient level for the regime to use? I didn't get that answer from what your response.
I answered the question earlier by saying that I think what we flag in terms of suspicious transactions and how we focus on the more pertinent patterns of transaction is perhaps the area where I would put focus rather than the $10,000 number itself. So that would.
So should the number just be removed, or do we need that anymore?
I would say I think some level is important so that minor transactions, can't flow without that level of attention. Happy to bring forward, some thoughts that we have in terms of, is it the right number? Should it be higher? Should it be lower? I think some level of consistency is important. We do have instances that we flag in our administrative section whereby the threshold is different. It's $3,000, it's $5,000. I think there's merit to having a single threshold. In terms of the exact number, I think I would prefer to hold on that question for today. Happy to talk to our partners and see what we can bring forward to the committee to inform that question for members.
Okay, I'd like to go to another issue you raised, and it's around Project Guardian and the ongoing opioid crisis that's happening across the country from coast to coast to coast, including my riding of the Northwest Territories. Many members of the regime, including FINTRAC, are involved in the anti-fentanyl initiative, Project Guardian, and I'd like to know more about it. Can you give me more details of the project and its function and maybe some of the impacts that has happened to date?
With respect, Mr. Chair, I think FINTRAC is the better witness to walk you through that. So I refer to them. They've worked very closely with any number of partners and can answer in detail.
Okay. I still got time? Another question. Since the last review of the Act, we've seen a lot of significant increase in technology and popularity of technology relevant to the regime and in areas of cryptocurrency and crowdfunding. And I'm curious to know how the regime has adapted in these areas since the last review. And maybe you could tell us if there's further tools that are needed to do a better job.
Mm-hmm. So the last review pointed us towards the evolving types of payments, and and that includes things like prepaid cards. So we have brought forward legislative changes, regulatory changes that attempt to capture the innovation that's going on in the financial space, so that as new methods come on stream that bring greater convenience to Canadians, that we do capture them in the regime, but we do it with a sensitivity to local realities. For example, we received in consultations the advice that prepaid cards are important for remote communities who may not have branch banking. So we wanted to be careful to not bring in new requirements that would be onerous for people who are trying to, do basic transactions in a way that lets them get on with their lives.
Thank you. We've only got about 6 minutes left, so if anybody's got a quick question, raise your hand. Ms. O'Connell, you're on.
So I just had a question in regards to kind of cryptocurrencies again, and if the international community somewhat agrees with the definitions, because I know Canada's defined it in terms of some of the reports, and FATF has kind of come out with some of it. So is it internationally being defined somewhat consistently? Because if not, I would think that that would then lead to other issues in terms of internationally regulating it. Or is it somewhat too early in that jurisdictions are still somewhat working towards it and even figuring out amongst themselves what it is? But I guess my question is really about the defining of cryptocurrencies, and then therefore how do we globally regulate it?
Speak quickly to sort of the FATF and where we are, and then Maxime, I think, can talk in more detail about where we are. So clearly within the Financial Action Task Force and within our guidance, there's quite a clear understanding of what the cryptocurrencies are. And again, it's this balance. We're not directly trying to regulate cryptocurrencies. We're just trying to ensure that as a mechanism for making payments and for transferring value, that it falls under the regime in the sense of, record keeping, knowing who they are, and managing the risks. So I think, there's a fairly well-known understanding of what the requirements are within our FATF environment. But Maxime can talk a bit more about the actual work we're doing.
Yes, so they are, it is one issue to nail down, like in regulatory speak, what we're talking about, but people know what we're talking about, so that's not necessarily the issue. And in terms, and as Ian pointed out, the purpose of the regulations we are working on is not to regulate the virtual currencies themselves. I'm not aware that any country is attempting to do that. What we are attempting to do is what we call the on-ramps and off-ramps. So there is a level of anonymity within the virtual currency space, although I would posit that actually there's actually a great detail of records that also take place. It's just that you don't necessarily know who is sitting behind them. So our purpose is once you try to move between the virtual currencies or move into what we call fiat currency, so the Canadian dollar, for example, that all of these on-ramps, off-ramps, there are requirements in place when those dealers in virtual currency are offering the service of converting virtual currency into, let's say, dollars, that then they do apply what the types of obligations that, for example, money services businesses have to apply in terms of identifying the client, keeping records of the transaction, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Fergus.
I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if either three of you are the lawyers. How much does the notion of the charter weigh upon you in terms of recommending des pistes d'action to address these issues?
It weighs on us fundamentally and heavily and significantly. I think your opening question, set forth the competing objectives in this space. There's respect for the Charter, there's effectiveness in terms of safety and security of Canadians, and then there's appropriate burden in both the private sector and public sector, the appropriate resourcing. In terms of compliance with the Charter, we have structured the regime from its initial stages to put in place this division in terms of what FINTRAC receives in terms of its information, and then the fact that it doesn't do investigations but rather passes the information, once it meets a reasonable threshold, to law enforcement agencies, CRA, others, that have the appropriate warrant powers and safeguards in their own space to make sure that Canadians' information is being used appropriately.
The charter is also a flexible document, though. I mean, it does take into account the changing attitudes of the time. I'm wondering, is there a sense amongst officials, at least, that the charter could evolve, or the context could evolve, so that the charter might be more flexible on the question of tracking, or putting some limitations on the right to privacy? Or more limitations on the right to privacy, so that we can ensure that we're not engaging in money laundering or terrorist financing.
So I would, Mr. Chair, defer the large part of that question to Justice colleagues, who I understand will be invited to appear. I think the evolution in the legal space, coupled with the evolution in the technological space, does give a promise that it's the algorithms, it's the patterns of that which is problematic that can be brought together so that it's, in a sense, people's suspicious behavior that surfaces to the fore with the right protections to ensure that there isn't inappropriate search and seizure and other legal concepts that the Charter was put in place to protect in that balance of democracy and privacy versus safety and security.
We'll have to leave it at that. Thank you all. I would just on your discussion paper, I do note, and for people who may pay attention to this committee versus the finance website, the discussion paper is on the Department of Finance website, and submissions on this paper will close on April 30th, I understand, so that's just for information. From today's, I think you can figure you will be invited back on the discussion paper itself. In one sec, Dan. Although I do note in here you lay out the key developments since the last review and the legislative and regulatory amendments, if you could, really in response to what Mr. Dussault asked earlier, if you could try and, as best you can, I know it's fairly difficult, I'm told it's very difficult, as best you can, give us some kind of response on what's happened with each of those recommendations, 18 that were in the last review, the Senate review report. Dan?
Yeah, just in regards to the website or whatnot, because there are a number of people that may actually want to follow the committee's work, and since we've referenced the document, perhaps we could actually put a link on our website, as well as to maybe some of the information the analysts have prepared. I'm not sure if that's protocol, but I certainly think the more people know about this and get involved, the better.
Okay, we can look at that through the Finance Committee as well. Okay, thank you again. I think we had a very broad exchange. Meeting adjourned.
We're just talking about the finance.
you.